All right, hello, welcome back. We're going to continue our notes about solving quadratic equations. Last time we talked about solving by graphing. And so this time we're going to head into section 7.4, which is a bit out of order. But section 7.4 is solving quadratics by factoring. Okay? And so it's very important here that you know how to factor. If you don't know how to factor, that's going to be a problem. So you either need to go back and rewatch all those factoring videos, or come see me for extra practice, okay? But it's very, very crucial that if we're going to solve by factoring, you need to know how to factor, okay? And so the goal here, let's talk about the goal of this section. The goal is to be able to solve a problem like 5x squared plus 15x plus 10 equals 0 by factoring, okay? Now these all can be solved by graphing as well, but if I specifically tell you that you need to factor, then you're not going to get points if you decide to graph instead, okay? So that's thing number one. So that's the goal of this. In fact, that's going to be our last example today, all right? So before we get into that, let's just talk about the basic equation of 6x equals 0. Okay? Most of you will say, okay, well, to get x by itself, you divide by 6, so x equals 0. And it's pretty straightforward and simple, right? And that's great. That's the correct answer. However, I kind of want you to think of it a little bit differently now. Instead of, just going through the motions of inverse operations of division or addition or whatever I give you, I want you to think of it like this. 6 times some number x equals 0. Okay, and if you think about it like that, 6 times what would get you to 0? Well, the only option we have is that x equals 0, because the only way to get to 0 is if one of them is 0, right? And so x must be 0 because the other number is 6, okay? But what if I gave you something like a times b equals 0? I said two numbers multiplied together equals 0, okay? Then the conclusion that you must draw is that one of them has to be 0, right? The only way we get to 0 through multiplication is if one of them is 0. So that's actually a math rule, and it's called the zero product property. Okay, and the zero product property says this. If a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0 or they're both 0. Okay? That's what the zero product property says. It says if you have a product of two numbers and their product is 0, then either one of them is 0 or they're both 0. Okay, and you're probably like, Ms. Bachman, what does this have to do with anything? Well, let me show you. Okay, so I've got 4 examples for you today. Let's take a look here at example 1. So example 1 is that I want you to solve 2x times x minus 4 equals 0 by factoring. Okay, now it is already in factored form, so that's good. That's the first step, is to make sure it's in factored form, and that just means you can't factor this anymore, okay? You've already factored it. So now we're going to use the zero product property to say, okay, I've got two things multiplied together here. I've got 2x and I've got x minus 4. So I've got two things multiplied together that equal 0. So the zero product property tells us then, well, then either 2x equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. And then from there, it becomes an Algebra 1 problem from first semester where you divide by 2, so x equals 0, and then you add 4, so x is equal to 4. And those are your two solutions here. Okay? And remember, you can always check your answers, and there's two ways to check. The first is by plugging them in. Okay, so if we plug in 0, so we've got 2 times 0 times 0 minus 4. Oh, would you look at that? You got 0. Okay, let's try the other one, make sure we're right. 2 times 4 times 4 minus 4. Oh my gosh, that's 0 too. You also could plug it into the calculator. 2x, x minus 4. Go to the graph, and remember, solutions are found where we cross the x-axis. And you can see from the graph that we cross the x-axis at 0 and at 4. Okay? So that's the cool thing about solving, is that there's probably more than one way to check your answer, which is super nice. Okay? So with that, let's head into example 2. Okay? In example 2, I want you to solve 2x plus 1 squared is equal to 0. All right? And I want you to be careful here because there's a couple different ways you could approach this problem, but specifically in this section, you need to remember that 2x plus 1 squared is the same thing as 2x plus 1 times 2x plus 1. Okay? And now you've got two things multiplied together that equal 0. So either the first one is equal to 0 or the second one is equal to 0. Now in this case, they're the same thing, so that's okay. But just get in the habit of writing down either this one is 0 or that one is 0. So then we finish solving. We subtract 1, and then we divide by 2, so x is equal to negative 1/2. And then you could just look at the other one and say, oh, it's basically the same thing, okay? But you only have to list the answer once. So the answer here, the solution, the root, the 0, is x equals negative 1/2, okay? You could list it twice if you wanted to, but that just doesn't make sense to me if you did that. But anyway, you could. So this is an example of having one solution. That means that the vertex of this parabola occurs at the x value of negative 1/2. And you could plug this into the graphing calculator and see that that's how that works. Okay? All right. Now, let's look at example 3. Okay? In example 3, I'm going to say solve 2x squared plus 8x equals 0 by factoring. All right, now this one looks a little different because this one is not factored yet. So we need to factor it. And remember, the number one rule of factoring is take out a greatest common factor. Okay, and if you notice, the greatest common factor here is 2 and x. That's the biggest thing that they both have in common. Okay, so if we take out a 2x, all right, what we have left is an x plus 4. Okay, and then this now looks like example 1, where if we've got two things multiplied together, then either the first one equals 0 or the second one equals 0. And then we can solve. So divide by 2, x is equal to 0. Or minus 4, x is equal to negative 4. All right. So that's the situation that we got on going there. Okay. Example 4. We're going to go back to our goal now. I think we're finally ready for it. We're going to solve, actually I'm going to write it a little bit differently, but we're going to solve 5x squared plus 15x equals negative 10. All right, now this looks different hold on, by factoring. I need to be specific here because I think you'll probably choose graphing if I don't give you away, which is fine, but I need to give you away. So we need to solve this by factoring, okay? Now, you cannot solve a lot of these until you do a very important thing of setting it equal to 0. And right now we're setting equal to 10. So basically, we need this side to be 0. And if we need that side to be 0, then we need to get rid of that negative 10 by adding 10 to both sides. And so now we have 5x squared plus 15x plus 10 is equal to 0. Okay? And now this looks like the goal problem. So if you ever see something that says solve and it's not set equal to 0, you probably should set it equal to 0. Okay? Now we can factor. All right, the number one rule of factoring is to take out a greatest common factor. And the greatest common factor of all three of these terms is 5. Okay? So if we take out a 5, we are left with x squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. Okay? Okay, so now what's really cool is that this can be factored further. This factors to, well, let's set up our skeleton. We know that has to be x and x. I need two numbers that multiply to 2 and add to 3. And those two numbers are 2 and 1. Plus and plus. Okay? So now we have a fully factored quadratic. And we know that if you've got some things multiplied together, then either one of them is 0 or they're all 0. Okay? So we've got 5 times x plus 2 times x plus 1. So we've actually got three things. But if you notice, it wouldn't really make sense to say 5 equals 0, right? And so we can essentially just ignore it. If you've got a number out in the front, just ignore it. Okay? And then you only have to worry about the other two factors. So x plus 2 equals 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. And so then we minus 2, so x is equal to negative 2, or minus 1, so x is equal to negative 1. And again, check your answers. Plug them in. Plug and chug. Look at the graph. See if that's where they cross. Okay, check your work. A lot of people don't do well on this test simply because they make little errors, and they would have caught that if they would just check their work. Okay? My guess is if you're having issues with this section, it's because you can't factor. So if you are having issues factoring, please hear me right now. Go back and watch the factoring videos. They are still on our Google Classroom page. Okay? That is a skill that I expect you to already know. So I'm not going to spend any time reteaching factoring. It's your responsibility that if you still are having issues factoring, that you get that down. Okay? There are there's more topics than just factoring in this section, so you're not going to completely fail because you can't factor, but it is going to hurt you. So do what you need to do, and we will talk in class, so come with those questions, okay?